When you think about what goes into the medicines you take, it can sometimes feel like looking into this really complex world.
Yeah, it really can.
How are all those ingredients chosen? And like, who's checking that everything is, well, up to snuff?
Uh-huh.
That's actually what we're diving into today.
Exactly. And we're zooming in on something pretty fundamental in drug development and manufacturing, starting materials.
Starting materials. Okay.
And these aren't just, random chemicals mixed together. Not at all. They're very specifically selected substances, and they're rigorously controlled right from the get-go.
Right. So the mission for this deep dive then is to sort of make sense of how these starting materials get picked, how they're justified. We want to try and cut through some of that complexity
Hmm.
and show why this area that sounds really technical is actually vital for the quality and safety of the medications people rely on. Think of it like the foundation, right? The bedrock of their pharmaceuticals.
That's a great way to put it. And yeah, to give you this understanding, we've looked at quite a range of sources, strict guidelines from regulatory bodies, scientific articles, things like that, all about the drug development process.
Okay, fantastic. So let's get right down to it then. When we talk about starting materials in the context of making drugs, what exactly are we referring to?
Okay. So in drug substance development that's making the active ingredient, the API starting materials are specific substances.
Mm.
They're chosen because they become significant structural parts of that final API molecule.
Significant structural parts, like key building blocks.
Precisely. Key building blocks you strategically start with. It's a very deliberate choice, not just grabbing the first chemical off the shelf.
Got it. So definitely not arbitrary. There's a real logic behind picking these specific initial components.
Absolutely. And deciding what counts as a starting material isn't just a scientific choice. It carries significant regulatory weight.
Ah,
That designation, that label, it has ripple effects all through the drug's life cycle. It affects how it's developed, how it's manufactured, controlled, and ultimately how it gets approved.
regulatory implications. Okay,
Yeah.
that sounds like there must be some pretty specific rules dictating this whole process.
Oh, definitely. Regulatory bodies like the FDA in the US or EMA in Europe, they have quite clear expectations for how starting materials are chosen. And maybe even more importantly, how companies justify those choices.
Justify them.
Yeah, it's not enough to just say, we use this.
Hmm.
You have to provide a solid rationale, a strong argument for why it's appropriate to designate that specific substance as your starting point.
And what kind of rationale are they looking for? What makes one choice, better or more justifiable than another in their eyes?
Well, the main thing is usually the material's role in the synthetic pathway, like how does it chemically transform through the reaction steps to become the API. But another huge factor is the quality and purity of the starting material itself.
Quality and purity. Okay.
Regulators need assurance that the foundation you're building on is solid, that it's clean, well-defined.
That makes total sense because if you start with something impure, those impurities could, I guess, potentially carry through and end up in the final medicine.
Exactly right. I mean, you look at regulations like CFR Title 21, Part 211 in the U.S., it talks broadly about protecting all raw materials from contamination when they arrive during storage.
Uh-huh.
But that principle is especially critical for starting materials because they're so early in the chain and contribute directly to the API structure. So, yeah, that initial quality is a major focus for regulators.
Okay. So it's not just identifying the material. Pharmaceutical companies really have to build a case for their selection. What goes into that justification? What are they looking at?
It's a mix, really, scientific and technical factors. One key thing is the complexity of the API molecule you're trying to make.
How complex it is.
Yeah. If you're building a really intricate structure, you might reasonably need to start with something that's already fairly complex itself, something that already has some of those key structural features built in.
Okay, that makes sense. What other factors play into justifying a starting material?
Another big one is the number of chemical steps between your proposed starting material and the final API. How many reactions are left?
Right.
Generally speaking, if you designate something that's very close structurally to the final API, meaning only a few chemical steps remain, that starting material is going to face much tougher scrutiny.
So fewer steps left means more scrutiny on the starting point. Why is that?
The logic is that any impurities present in that late-stage starting material, have fewer opportunities, fewer purification steps to be removed before you get to the final API. The risk of them carrying through is higher.
I see. So it's kind of an inverse relationship there. Fewer steps remaining makes the starting material quality even more critical.
Exactly. So the
Yeah.
justification needs to convincingly show that, okay, even if our starting point is quite similar to the final drug, we have really robust controls in place. We understand the potential impurities. We can test for them. We can manage them effectively.
This whole process, it sounds like there are quite a few points where things could, potentially introduce risk. How do companies think about that proactively? How do they manage risk right from this early stage?
Yeah, that's absolutely key. And that's where risk assessment comes in as a really indispensable tool.
Risk assessment. Okay.
In this context, for starting materials, risk assessment is basically a systematic way to identify potential problem sources of variability, contamination risks, and then evaluate how likely they are and what impact they could have on the final API quality.
And how does actually doing a risk assessment help with choosing and justifying the starting material?
Well, by digging deep into the manufacturing process of the starting material itself, where do its raw materials come from? How is it synthesized? What side reactions or byproducts might it contain?
Ah, so looking even further back up the chain.
Exactly. By doing that thorough analysis, manufacturers can pinpoint where variability or contamination might creep in before it even reaches their own process. And that allows them to put the right controls in place much earlier. Testing specifications, supplier audits, things like that.
So it's really about this deep understanding of the entire supply chain and manufacturing process, not just for the API synthesis, but for the materials feeding into that synthesis too.
Precisely. And, this approach aligns very closely with the broader principles of quality by design, or QBD.
Oh, do you
And
really?
we don't need to get bogged down in all the details of QBD, but the core idea is being proactive, building quality, safety, and effectiveness into the product right from the beginning, based on scientific understanding and risk management.
So applying that risk-based thinking really early on in development.
Yeah, it's fundamental. It's fascinating how critical this thinking is right at the stage of selecting those initial building blocks.
You've mentioned these underlying principles, and it really sounds like even if we're not rattling off specific regulation numbers constantly, there's a consistent philosophy guiding this.
You're absolutely right. I mean, we haven't explicitly mentioned, say, ICHQ-11, which is a key guideline on developing and manufacturing APIs.
Okay.
But its principles are woven all through this. ICHQ-11 really emphasizes needing a thorough understanding of the API's synthetic route.
Hmm?
And that understanding is completely fundamental to making informed choices about starting materials.
And why is having that deep understanding of the whole synthesis so critical for picking the right starting points?
Because it allows the manufacturers to identify what are called critical process parameters, basically, the steps or conditions in the synthesis that have the biggest impact on the final quality of the API.
The most sensitive steps.
Exactly. By knowing those critical points throughout the entire route, they can then figure out the most appropriate stage to introduce a defined starting material. And crucially, what quality attributes that material must have to ensure you end up with a consistent, high-quality API every single time.
Right. It's about building that quality in from the start, not just trying to test for it or fix problems at the very end.
That's the essence of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. The ultimate goal is always a consistent, high-quality API, and that journey truly begins with meticulously selecting and controlling those initial starting
It
materials.
makes sense.
And, the choice of starting material has a very, very direct impact on the kinds of impurities and the levels of those impurities that might show up in the final drug substance.
Oh, so.
Well, think about it. If you start with a material that already contains impurities that are structurally very similar to your target API, those can be incredibly difficult to separate out in later purification steps. It's kind of like trying to separate, I don't know, grains of sand that look almost identical versus pulling out a distinct pebble. Much harder.
That's a great analogy. Yeah, I can see that. So having really good analytical methods, ways to detect and measure these potential impurities, that becomes absolutely essential then.
Absolutely essential. Companies need sophisticated analytical tools and validated methods to find and quantify any significant impurities that might be coming from the starting materials or formed from them.
Right.
And as we sort of touched on earlier with regulations like CFR 211, the guidelines are very clear. Manufacturers must have adequate controls over the quality of their starting materials, specifically to minimize the risk of any harmful impurities carrying over into the final drug product that reaches the patient. It's a multi-layered safety net.
So this whole complex dance of selecting, justifying, controlling starting materials. It isn't just like a regulatory checkbox exercise companies have to tick off. It actually has real, tangible effects on, well, the efficiency and maybe even the cost of developing and manufacturing new medicines.
Oh, absolutely, no question. A really well thought out, well justified starting material strategy can genuinely streamline the regulatory review process.
How?
Well, if a company has clearly done its homework, presents a robust scientific rationale, shows strong controls, it just gives regulators more confidence. It can lead to fewer questions, smoother reviews, potentially quicker approvals.
Okay.
Conversely, if the strategy is weak or poorly justified, you can expect delays, lots of back and forth with the agency asking for more data, more justification.
And what about on the actual manufacturing floor? Does it impact production?
Big time. On the
Yeah.
manufacturing side, using starting materials that are well characterized and consistently meet their quality specifications is crucial for a reliable supply chain.
Makes sense.
If you have high confidence in the quality of your initial building blocks, you're much less likely to run into unexpected problems during large-scale production, things like batch failures, yield issues, out-of-spec results. Some sources, like articles in OPR&D, often point to inconsistencies in starting material quality as a root cause when scale-up goes wrong.
Right. So it really does all circle back to this seemingly early fundamental step of choosing and controlling the right starting materials. It's not a minor detail at all. It's really a cornerstone for ensuring the medicines we rely on are safe, effective, and consistently available.
Precisely. That's the takeaway. The detailed regulatory scrutiny, the emphasis on risk assessment throughout this process, it's all designed to provide that critical assurance right from those very first chemical building blocks.
It really makes you appreciate all the sort of unseen work and rigor that goes into getting a medicine from a lab bench to your local pharmacy shelf. Thinking about how even those initial ingredients are so carefully selected and controlled, it just highlights the immense complexity involved.
It truly does. And, for listeners who find this intriguing and want to know more, the websites of regulatory agencies, FDA, EMA, others, actually have a lot of publicly available information, guidance documents, reports, explaining their expectations for pharmaceutical quality, including starting materials. It could be its own deep dive.
Definitely something worth exploring if you want to sort of pull back the curtain even further on how medicines are made. Well, thank you for shedding so much light on this absolutely crucial foundational aspect of drug development today.
My pleasure. It's a critical area.